Today, we're going to be talking about ancient Egypt. So when we look at ancient Egypt, we can look at our timeline. We're going from about 4500 before Christ all the way to 330 after Christ. So that would be, and to 641 to the Byzantine period. So we see the dynasties of Egypt here in pre-dynastic, early dynastic period, Old Kingdom, Intermediate, Middle Kingdom, Second Intermediate period, and then New Kingdom and Third Intermediate period. And we'll be talking a little bit about those different periods again briefly. So let's take a look at Egypt. So one of the most important things about Egypt that we have to understand is that the Nile would every year would rise, and it would rise several meters, which is quite a bit. And when the Nile rose, what would happen is these areas along the river would be filled with what was on the bottom of the river. Because it was so rough, it would all get kind of roughed up, and the silt would go over into the lands alongside the river, and then it would make them more fertile. And so there's this very cyclical event of how the Nile would rise and increase the river volume due to the rains in the south and outside of the Egyptian borders in the mountains of Ethiopia. And then the Nile Valley would be transformed into a huge lake, and then the fields would be completely submerged, and many cities and villages became temporary islands. And then in September, the water would recede, and it would leave behind this beautiful fine silt, which was a perfect fertilizer for the fields. And then people would be able to grow food, and this would, lead to the growth and prospering of the Egyptians. So let's talk a little bit about the Egyptian symbolism. So first we have the white crown of Upper Egypt, and then we have the red crown of Lower Egypt, and then the double crown, which is when the pharaohs actually were unified. And then we have the Wedjat, the eye of Horus, the falcon, the god of Horus, and then Horus, the sun disk, the cobra, the scepter, and the Ankh. And there's our Ankh and the scarab. So we'll kind of go through these one by one. So the Hedjet, ancient Egyptian Hedjet, white one, is the white crown of pharaonic Upper Egypt. After the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, it was combined with the Deshret, the red crown of Lower Egypt, to form the Peshent, which was the double crown of Egypt, composed of the red and white crowns, the Deshet and Hedjet representing Lower and Upper Egypt respectively. It represented the unity of Egypt and the total control of the pharaoh over all of Egypt. Those would be when we had the pre-dynastic periods. That would have been where there were two separate, it was not unified. So now we'll go to the Wedjat, which was also known as the Eye of Horus, and as the Eye of Ra. And it was known in ancient Egyptian as a slogan to protect against envy, disease, harmful animals, and evil spirits, and also good health and royal power. It is the most famous of all ancient Egyptian symbols. The Eye of Horus also represents sacrificial and curative qualities. The ancient Egyptians mastered the industry as it was made of gold and includes the form of the god Ra. The necklace was placed for the pharaoh's mummy, thinking that it might protect him in his tomb. Horus's eye was used as a magic spell for the time when Horus hired her to restore life to her father Osiris, and then spread widely and became very popular in all of ancient Egypt. The god Horus, represented as a falcon or as a human with a falcon head, was a sun god, as well as the ancient Egyptian god of kinship. So we call this polytheism, as opposed to Christianity, which would be monotheism. So we believe in one God, one true God. So the Egyptians felt that there was a kinship with the god in terms of their king. So the king, or the pharaoh, literally was the physical embodiment of God in their mind. So they were the living king of Egypt, was also the Egyptian god. So falcons, along with other birds, could have easily been seen by everyone in ancient Egypt. The Ankh was a symbol of, sometimes referred to as the key of life or the key of the Nile. It was representative of eternal life in ancient Egypt. And so there's an interesting thing about like eternal life in terms of the way, like some historians believe that because of the way the Nile would raise every year and it would lay its silt and it would, have this cyclical, that the king or the pharaoh would be alive, but then when he would die, he would go into the afterlife and he would have eternal life. And that his living representation would be the new king. So they were the same. It wasn't like that was a new person. It was the same God. It just was embodied by this new king. So the interesting thing about the Ankh is that it actually was created by Africans long before. The Ankh is said to be the first or the original cross. And then we have the scarab. So scarabs were symbols of rebirth, just like we talked about with the Nile. This idea of resurrection, transformation, and growth. So people would wear scarabs and amulets for good luck and protection. The bodies of the dead were often adorned with scarabs to ensure that they could safely travel to the afterlife and move into the next world. So to the ancient Egyptians, their soul or their being was made up of many different parts. It wasn't like they just had one soul. They had like several, like 8 different immortal or semi-divine parts of their body that they then thought, this soul, spiritual part, that would survive death. With the body making 9 parts being the one part of the human, that as human. So the precise meaning of the Ka, that was one of the terms for the soul, the Ba, the Ach, and the Him, Sachem, and so on, are no longer completely clear. Scholars try again and again to force Egyptian ideas of the soul into our traditional categories, but they aren't explicit enough. So we do know that a person's name was given to them at birth with all the semi-divine parts that could then join together, so all the parts of their soul, and they would live as long as that name was spoken. And this is one of the reasons why when you go into the Egyptian pyramids and you will see the name of the king written over and over and over again, it was like they couldn't be there praying and saying the name, but the words would be there so that it was like spoken in silence, if you will. This is why efforts were made to protect a name. So one of the things they did was they created what were known as cartouches. And cartouche literally translates as magical rope. And it was used to surround the name and to protect it for all eternity. The Egyptians also had the Book of the Dead, which was an ancient Egyptian collection of mortuary texts that were made up of spells and magic formulas, and they were placed in the tomb and believed to protect and aid the deceased in the hereafter, and kind of show the soul or the Ka of the dead person where to go and what to do. And so that's why when you look in the tombs like Tutankhamun, and there's so many artifacts that are left behind, it was so that the soul of Tutankhamun would have stuff to do. There was even games. There was like 1,500 pairs of socks. I mean, it's ridiculous, all the different things that were buried in the pyramid in the burial chamber of Tutankhamun. So here's another section of the Book of the Dead. And again, it's painted and inscribed on papyrus. And there we see the scales of life. And in the middle, we've got Horus. And there's the king with the white, kind of almost looks like a bowling pin, if you will. Archaeologists found this papyrus in the burial of Nani, a woman in her 70s. She was a chantress, a ritual singer of the god Amun-Re, and is referred to as king's daughter, or probably meaning she was daughter of the high priest of Amun-Re and the titular king Pinochem I at the time. As was customary, her coffin and boxes of Shabbos figures of substitute workers for afterlife. So they would have little workers that they would make little sculptures of that would go with, so that you wouldn't have to do all the work by yourself. They were accompanied by a hollow wooden Osiris figure, which contained a papyrus scroll inscribed with a collection of texts that Egyptians call the Book of the Dead. So the Ka, the physical form, the body that would decay after death, the mortal outward part of the human that could only be preserved by mummification, that was the Khat, and or is spelled K-H-A, and it was spelled pronounced K-H-A-T. The Ka, the double that lingered in the tomb, inhabiting the body, or even statues of the deceased, but was also independent of the person and could move about and eat and drink at will. So there was both a higher guardian angel like Ka and a lower Ka that came with the knowledge that the person learned on earth. An interesting point to note is that the Egyptians believed that animals, plants, water, and even stones had their own Ka, just like Native Americans, tend to believe in Mother Earth and all of the plants and animals, having their own spirit. A human Ka could move around while a person slept and even inhabit a plant if the Ka so desired. So rather than to just be a human, the Ka could manifest itself to be anything. So the Ka could become a ghost to others, both when the person was born and when the person was dead or alive. So, kind of like in a dream state. It was even thought to haunt those who did wrong to it. If family failed to make their offerings, and the starving and thirsty Ka could haunt them until they corrected the error and made sure that the name was spoken. So the Ahu was the immortal part, the radiant and shining being that lived in the Sahu, the intellect, will and intention of the deceased that transfigured death and ascended to the heavens to live with the gods or the imperishable stars. The Sahu, which is another part of the soul, was the incorruptible spiritual body of the person that could dwell in the heavens, appearing from the physical body after the judgment of the dead was passed, and if they were successful with all their mental and spiritual abilities of the living body. So if they lived a good life, they could, live on. Sekhem, this was the incorporeal personification of the life force, which lived in heaven with the Ach and after death. The Ba, the human-headed bird, flitted around in the tomb during the day, bringing air and food to the deceased, but traveled with the Ra on the solar, barge during the evenings. The Khabit was the shadow of the man. It could partake of funerary offerings and was able to detach itself from the body and travel at will, though it always was thought to stay very close to the Ba. The Ab, or Eb, the heart, was the source of good and evil within a person, and the moral awareness and the center of death, or be eaten by Amut, the final death, if it failed to weigh equally against the Mat. So the Mat was like the peace. Like if they didn't live a peaceful life and they had did a lot of bad things, they may not live long in the afterlife. The Ren was the true name, a vital part of the person on their journey through life and the afterlife, a magical part that could destroy the person if the name was obliterated, or could give power of the person if someone knew the Ren. Naming ceremonies in Egypt were kept secret, and a child lived their whole life with a nickname to avoid anyone from learning what their true name was. In Egypt, one person could have multiple afterlives. Each different part of the person could be able to have its own existence after death. If they survived the trials of the underworld, the Osirian judgment of the dead with all of its magic spells, then while the Khat lie in the tomb, the dead body, ready to be animated then by the Ka, the Ba might be traveling the underworld with the Ra, and the Ab is with the gods, and the Khabit might be with the Ba on the barge or in the tomb, eating some of the good stuff that the people left behind when they made their offerings. And at the same time, the Aku and the Sekhem and the Saha might be contentedly living up in the stars, looking down at all the different people on earth. So, as you can see, it was a little bit complicated, but extremely interesting, and it always makes you wonder, like, where all of these different cultural themes and symbols came from. This is the Palette of Narmer. So in 1898, J.E. Quibble excavated the royal residences of various early Egyptian kings at Heracleopolis in Upper Egypt when he discovered a large ceremony slate palette of King Narmer. It was around 3000 before Christ. He also found many other objects, but the Palette of Narmer was the most interesting because it had a shield shape and it was decorated on both sides, and it depicts Narmer defeating his enemies, kind of like what we saw with the stele of Naram-Sin, except this was not a stele. The palette was made to symbolize the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. The pharaoh is wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, smiting a captive of war. A hawk, maybe the king himself, holds an enemy by a nose ring and sits upon 6 flowers, and that literally means 6,000. So that's where that comes from, the number of prisoners that the Egyptians took. The name Narmer is represented in hieroglyphics in the Serech sign located at the top of the palette. And what the palette was used for is, you know how when you see football players and different sports, and they put that little black marker, like that black underneath their eyes? So it was like a charcoal that was mixed with a wax, and it was used to deflect the sun, and we see the Egyptians wearing it regularly. So this is kind of the first eye makeup. And it was mixed where those double-headed lion figures are on the back side of the palette there. Egyptian burial. So Egyptian burial, as you can imagine, because of the belief in the afterlife, was extremely important. The earliest ancient Egyptians buried their dead in small pits in the desert. The heat and the dryness of the sand dehydrated the bodies very quickly and created lifelike and natural mummies. So kind of like if you've heard of bog people where it like preserves the body, well, that's what also happened in the desert. So later, the ancient Egyptians began burying their dead in coffins to protect them from the wild animals in the desert. The bodies placed in the coffins decayed when they were not exposed to the hot, dry sand of the desert. So they then decided to create a mixture of the salt and sand, and they called it natron. Natron is found in abundance along the Nile River. Natron is a mixture of 4 different salts: sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, and sodium sulfate. The sodium carbonate works as a drying agent, drying out the water from the body, and at the same time, the bicarbonate, when subjected to moisture, increases the pH level that creates a hostile environment for bacteria. So that keeps the body from rotting away. The Egyptian climate lent itself to the mummification process because it was both very hot and very dry. The Egyptians mummified their bodies because their physical form was an integral part to their afterlife. Remember, their body was the 9th part of the soul, called the Khat, the K-A-H, and kind of pronounced K-H-A-T. Being such a practical people, liking what they could see and touch, an existence without a physical body was completely unacceptable to them. Even the destruction of the heart, the spiritual ab, rather than the physical heart, would mean the death of all the other parts of the being. So it was extremely important to them that they preserve the body. It meant that the physical heart was preserved right along with the physical body. Other rituals point to the importance of the physical body after death. The opening of the mouth ceremony, allowing the body to breathe, while other rituals were performed on the corpse to allow the deceased to see and to hear the land of eternity. And there, they called them canopic jars, and they would put the different parts of the body, they would preserve them in the natron salts for days, and then they would wrap them up and put them in these canopic jars. So remember how we talked about the Sumerian ziggurats? Well, here we see the very first pyramids, and they were known as mastabas. And they were tombs, not temples, like the ziggurats. The ziggurats are temples that surrounded the pyramids of the Old Kingdom. So remember, we had the pre-kingdom, and then we have the Old Kingdom, and then we go into the intermediate, and then the medium kingdom, and then the new kingdom and the intermediate. So there's like 3 different levels of intermediate. So courtiers and families of the monarch were buried in these low rectangular brick or stone structures. Just like the pyramids, they were built on the west side of the Nile, the symbol of death. So then they call the underworld, or where the sun sets, that's the underworld. So it goes into darkness, and that's always in the west. So they often called the afterlife the land of the west. Mastaba tombs surround the pyramids of the Old Kingdom. Courtiers and families and monarchs, all would be buried in these tombs. And there you can see the steppedness of the tomb. So see how that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps. So Djoser, this guy, this is a limestone statue. It's thought to be the oldest life-size sculpture surviving from Egypt. It had once been covered with plaster and painted. So that's the thing too, is a lot of times we see these really old sculptures and they're all white, and we think that's what they were like in ancient times, and they weren't. Many times they were painted to be very, very lifelike, and we know that because they've done radiocarbon testing, and from the marble or stone that they were carved from, and they can find the paint pieces in there. It once was covered with plaster and painted. The eyes were inlaid as well, probably with lapis lazuli. His appearance becomes traditional for royal portrait sculpture. He wears a simple kilt, a black wig, and a false ceremonial beard, and the royal headdress. Djoser was responsible for the world's first monumental stone building, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara. The pyramid design evolved throughout its construction, and its architectural form changed as the Egyptians adapted to their new building material, stone, as opposed to making mud bricks. So mud bricks were basically a form. They would make a form out of wood, and they would pour the mud into it, and they would let it dry hard in the sun with the natron and everything else in there. And then that they could use as a building block. But eventually they would erode. So the stone was much better. The architect of the Step Pyramid is thought to have been Djoser's son, Imhotep, who was later deified for his achievements. So he was considered a god because of it. The fact that Djoser was able to build such a massive and innovative structure suggests that during his reign, Egypt was politically stable and had a successful economy. So this is called the Hepsed. So the Hepsed is located at the main entrance or the cantor east of the courtyard of a pyramid. Traditionally, the Hepsed court is used to celebrate the 30-year reign of the king. The structure is purely symbolic. It's kind of like if you ever went to an old movie set in the Old West and all you saw were the fronts of the buildings, but there was nothing inside of them. That's what this was. And it was specifically for later on for the king's soul, for their spirit, the Ka and the Ba and the Ach and all the rest, so they could run the Hepsed and they could enjoy like a town. The structure is purely symbolic. It is called the Royal Pavilion or the Temple T. All the structures connected to the Hepsed celebrations were exact reproductions of similar structures that were actually used and of which no trace remains. They were utilized not so much for a royal celebration, but for a symbolic ceremony that permitted the Ka of the deceased king to celebrate the Hepsed eternally. Thus, he could then be regenerated. So, they believe that that was like a visual representation for the Ka. So next, let's take a look at the pyramids of Giza. So the Giza pyramid complex consists of the Great Pyramid, also known as the Pyramid of Cheops or Khufu. Those are, the two names given to Cheops and Khufu, is the same pharaoh. That was constructed in 2580 before Christ. Took about 20 years. The slightly smaller Pyramid of Khafre or Chephren, both names of the same pharaoh, a few hundred meters to the southwest, and the relatively modest-sized Pyramid of Menkaure, or Mykarinos, which is a few hundred meters away. So Khufu was the 4th dynasty, 2613 to 2498. and he built the Great Pyramid of Giza. Originally, the Great Pyramid stood 481 feet tall, although commonly called Cheops and also Sufris because of the late Greek influence on Egypt. The name Khufu is the original ancient Egyptian name for this king. So remember how we talked about some of the kings had like secret names and so forth? So there's that kind of a thing going on. That's why you'll see some of these kings have multiple names. And they also have different names in different languages, like Greek. So the name Khufu is the original ancient Egyptian name that the king demonstrated on his own cartouche. He reigned for approximately 24 years. And there we can see sort of the side of how a pyramid would look after it's been defaced. A lot of times you'll see how the top is much smoother. So people would rob the pyramids for stone, because why cut their own stone if they could use this stone 1,000 years later, right? So that was a common practice. Although the Great Pyramid had such fame, little is actually known about its builder, Khufu. Ironically, only a very small statue of 9 centimeters has been found depicting this historic ruler. This statue pictured above was not found in Giza near the pyramid, but was found to the south at the Temple of Osiris at Abydos, the ancient necropolis. So here's kind of an example of what a pyramid looks like on the inside. So there, you think it's going to be a big open area. It is not. It is solid. And they have chambers like caves. And so you have the original pyramid entrance and the pit, and then you go to the grand hall. And I've had friends who've gone to Egypt and literally crawled up these things, and they're like enough for like one body hunched over. So it's pretty scary stuff. So Khafre, who was the son of Khufu, was also known as Chephren. He ruled from 2520 to 2494 and is responsible for the second largest pyramid complex at Giza, which includes the Sphinx, a mortuary temple, and a valley temple. The most distinctive feature of Khafre's pyramid is at the topmost layer of smooth stones. There are only a few remaining casing stones on the Giza pyramid. The base of the pyramid was 704 feet on each side, covering a total area of 11 acres. The average weight of individual blocks of stone was 2.5 tons. Some of the outer casings of the stone weighed as much as 7 tons. Originally, it was 471 feet tall. Now it is 446 feet tall and had an angle incline of 53 degrees. The construction was limestone and red granite, and it was all built, with weight. Khafre may best be known for his statues, and most famous among them is, of course, the Sphinx. He was perhaps the greatest maker of the Pyramid Age. There are emplacements in his pyramid temple for 58 different statues, including 4 colossal sphinxes, each more than 26 feet long, 2 flanking each door of his valley temple, 2 colossal statues possibly of baboons in tall niches inside the entrance of the valley temple, and 23 life-size statues of the pharaoh in the valley temple, fragments of which have been found with his name inscribed on them. At least 7 large statues of him in the inner chambers of his mortuary temple, 12 colossal Khafre statues around the courtyard of his mortuary temple, and 10 more huge statues in the Sphinx temple. Graffiti left by the pyramid's visitor will be removed from the walls of the chamber and the corridor. However, the graffiti written by the famous Egyptologist Belzoni on the wall of the Khafre burial chamber in 1818 it remains as it is. It is now considered one of the main inner features of the pyramid. The Great Sphinx is to the northeast of the Khafre Valley Temple, where it sits. Was once a quarry temple. Was once a quarry for temples, rather. Khafre's workers shaped the stone into a lion and gave it their king's face over 4,500 years ago. Let's see. The figure was buried for most of its life in the sand, and then King Thutmose IV placed a stela between the front paws of the figure. It describes when Thutmose, while still a prince, had gone hunting and fell asleep in the shade of the Sphinx. You can see it kind of right there in the center. During a dream, the Sphinx spoke to Thutmose and told him to clear away the sand because it was choking the Sphinx. The Sphinx told him that if it did this, he would be rewarded with a kingship. And of course, Thutmose carried out that request, and the Sphinx held up their end of the deal. All right, this is called the Canon of Proportions, and we look at all these different sculptures and things that we see from the Egyptian, and we can see that things were very much it wasn't done on naturalism, the way we look at the Greeks later on or some of the other sculptures that we look at. It was done on a specific way that everything had to be, the feet had to be a certain width and height, the pharaoh had to be a certain height, they had to form in a certain way. So these classic proportions began to appear in royal figures around the 3rd dynasty and are almost universally found throughout the 5th and 6th centuries. Now, we see these sculptures of these kings, and when they say they all look alike, and why is that? Couldn't they make them look natural like the real person? Well, that wasn't the point. The point was that they were the same God, so they always would look alike, and they could build these amazing pyramids. So of course they could build something natural if they wanted to. So they deliberately returned to these proportions and time again for thousands of years. After periods of political upheaval and especially artistic change, they always would go back because they felt like this way it would keep the peace. Here's Menkaure and his queen. I think this is an interesting image because the statue of the pharaoh Menkaure and his queen are carved out of slate. It is an example of Old Kingdom 4th Dynasty royal sculpture. The statue, which stands 4 feet 8 inches high, was found in a hole dug earlier by treasure hunters below the floor of the room in the Valley Temple of the Pyramid of Menkaure at Giza. On January 18, 1910, digging revealed the heads of the statue. The following day, the pair was completely unearthed. The queen's status and that of all Egyptian women, but especially those of royal family, had been a matter of debate for many years. Women in Egypt seem to have enjoyed the same legal and economic rights as men, a situation which the Greeks write about and the Egyptians, and most Greeks and Romans found this very strange. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before Christ, and who had visited Egypt, lists among their contrary customs that women buy and sell, the men abide at home and they weave. So that was like, what? Why is that happening? Diodorus of Sicily, who had visited Egypt around 60 and 56 before Christ, writes that the Egyptians had a law permitting men to marry their sisters, and adds that it was ordained that the queen should have greater power and honor than the king, and that among private persons the wife always enjoys authority over her husband. Such notions have contributed to the so-called heiress theory, which argues that the right to the throne of ancient Egypt was transmitted through the female line, not the male line. A man, no matter what his status, be he the eldest son of the previous pharaoh or a commoner, became a pharaoh through his relationship to his queen. The pharaohship was legitimized through the marriage to the heiress, who was often the pharaoh's sister or half-sister. It was argued, therefore, that ancient Egypt was a matrilineal society where power resided always in the female line. The queen represented in the statue here is not a mere wife. Her position and her gesture should be interpreted not as indicating inferiority and submission, but signaling her legitimization of Menkaure as a pharaoh. See how she has her arm on his arm, her hand on his arm, and she's got her other arm around his waist? She is shown in the act of presenting him, indicating to the world that he is the man whom she is identifying and establishing as the pharaoh. Her pose, in fact, deliberately imitates that of the goddess Hathor in the Triad statues, and with whom she is clearly intended to be identified. The statue of itself is a representation of the act of confirmation and perhaps even a record of part of what might have been an actual ceremony. Original access was provided to the pyramid by inner chambers an entrance on the axis north wall, and it was about 4 meters above ground level. From there, a descending corridor, only partially lined with pink granite, sloped down at an angle of more than 26 degrees for 31 meters through the masonry core to the chambers below. The lower corridor terminates in a room with walls that were provided with niches. The purpose of this unusual room has always been debated by scholars. Another thing that's interesting is that Menaker's temple, also the site and inspiration for the Lara Croft Tomb Raiders level 4 Last Revelation. And so that was actually, like, they actually recreated the look of Menaker's hallways in that game. Hatshepsut, I always like to say, hot ketchup is a way to remember her name. Hatshepsut was born in the 15th century before Christ. She was the daughter of Thutmose I and Ahmes, both of royal lineage, was the favorite of all of his 3 children. Both 2 brothers died, and she was in the unique position to gain the throne upon the death of her father. To have a female pharaoh was unprecedented, and probably most definitely unheard of as well. When Thutmose passed away, his son, by the commoner Motnofrit, Thutmose II, technically ascended to the throne. For the first few years of his reign, however, Hatshepsut seemed to held the reign. From markings on his mummy, archaeologists believe Thutmose II had a skin disease, and he died after ruling for only 3 years. Hatshepsut, his half-sister and wife, was produced and had produced no offspring with him, and her daughter, Neferure, was most likely the daughter of her lover, Senmut, although he had sired a son through the commoner Isis. This son, Thutmose III, was in line for the throne, but due to his age, Hatshepsut was allowed to reign as Queen Dowager. She was not one to sit back and wait for her nephew to come of age to take her place. As a favorite daughter of a popular pharaoh and as charismatic and beautiful woman in her own right, she was able to command enough of a following to actually take control as pharaoh. She ruled for 15 years until her death in 1458 before Christ, and left behind more monuments and works of art than any other Egyptian queen to come. Hatshepsut, as a female, had many obstacles. There was always a threat of revolt because as her bitter nephew came of age, he would want the crown. Using propaganda and political skills, she deftly jumped each hurdle as she faced them. To quell the fears of her people, she became king, in parentheses, in all statuary and relief during her reign. So she actually had statues carved of her with a fake beard and everything as king. She even dressed in traditional garb of the male rulers, wearing a traditional crown and the shendel kilt and the Nemes headdress and the Khat headcloth, and of course, like I said, the false beard. This is what she built. It's her temple. It's on the banks of the Nile across from Thebes. It's a 3-tiered temple. It was found beneath hundreds of tons of sand and tens of centuries after its construction. The temple of Hatshepsut is far larger than Menhotep's. The architect was Senmut, Hatshepsut's lover, and a member of her court with more than 20 titles. Senmut designed the temple with rows of colonnades that reflect the vertical patterns displayed by the cliff backdrop. In this way, the temple is a successful example of architectural harmony between man and nature, and it was carved literally into the side of a mountain. Karnak is another very important Egyptian temple. It was a vast complex enlarged over a 1300 year period. So here's a drawing of the way that it was built. So they have capitals. They have columns with a capital that is like a bud, and then there's other capitals that are like the form of a flower, and then those other areas are open at the top where the roof line is, and that's called a clear story. So that's how light could come in. And notice that it's still post and lintel. So the posts are the columns and the lentils are the pieces that go across the top. And one of the things about Karnak is they weren't sure how far apart they could put the columns in order to make the building be bigger, have a bigger open space. So there's many, many columns throughout the space. And here's an image kind of looking up and sort of the vastness of these columns. And then also note all of the writing and the symbolism on all of the columns. Another great king was Ramses II. Ramses completed the great hypostyle hall at Karnak and continued to work on the temple built by Seti I at Abydos, both of which were left incomplete at the latter's death. Ramses also completed his father's funerary temple on the west bank of the Nile at Luxor, and also built one for himself, which is known as the Ramesseum. At Abydos, he built a temple of his own not far from that of his father. There was also 4 major temples in his residence city, not to mention many, many lesser shrines. So Ramses II completed the hypostyle hall at Karnak and continued to work on all of the other temples. This is some of the large sculptures that had to be moved for the dam that the Egyptians built some years back. So they literally dismantled all of this and moved all of it over so that it would, on higher ground, so that it wouldn't be destroyed. Here we have more images of Ramses. The next I want to talk about is Akhenaten. Amenhotep IV was the 10th or 11th pharaoh of dynasty, let's see, what would that have been, 18. He married Queen Nefertiti and worshipped in ancient Egypt the god named Aten, or the god of the sun disk. He renamed himself Akhenaten, who is in service to Aten in honor of the god, also spelled several different ways. During Akhenaten's reign from 1379 before Christ, Aten, also spelled with an O, Aton, became the supreme god of Egypt. So he changed from all the polytheism to one god. Akhenaten, possibly in a move to lessen the political power of the priests, introduced the worship of one god, the Aten. This meant that the pharaoh, not the priesthood, was the sole link between the population, the Egyptian people, and the Aten, which effectively ended the power of all the various temples that were built all around. So here we have an image of Akhenaten, Queen Nefertiti, and the royal princesses sunken into relief at Tel Armana, which they changed the capital. So they moved their capital. Also notice that these images are not in the canon of proportions. They are far more naturalistic than images that we've seen the Egyptians create prior to this time. So he built an entire city dedicated to Aten, complete with a necropolis and a royal tomb. The city was Akhenaten, with a T, T-A-T-E-N, the horizon of Aten. And at the peak of Akhenaten's reign, over 20,000 people lived there. The city was built in Middle Egypt on a site thought to have been chosen as it was not tainted by the worship of other gods. The backlash against the religion of Akhenaten led to widespread destruction of his palaces and temples. Work began on dismantling Akhenaten's temples shortly after it was abandoned, and along with many other of Akhenaten's monuments, its stone was reused by other pharaohs. Restoration work on the great pylons of Ramses II at Karnak showed that they used recycled Aten temples for the filling of these pylons. This has left modern archaeologists with the world's biggest jigsaw puzzle. And that's something that for the last 20 years or more, maybe 30 plus years, National Geographic's been involved in trying to figure out just what happened in that reign. Queen Nefertiti also was considered one of the most beautiful queens, and there we have an image. And notice again, it is not in that canon of proportions, but much more naturalistic. Really quite beautiful. Which brings us to Tutankhamun. So Tutankhamun came to the throne at the age of 9 and ruled until his death at about the age of 18. During his reign, he brought peace to his kingdom by restoring worship of all the Egyptian deities, including Amen. He was not an important king, but he is well known because his tomb had remained virtually intact until it was discovered by Howard Carter in November of 1922. And the full list of the Carter archives in the Cairo Museum has still, to this day, not been completely published, some, 100 years after the discovery. And the following are some of the photos of things that they found. And again, just so many different things, rings, just scarabs, all kinds of stuff. So when they poked a hole through the debris, they could see gold statues, strange replicas of animals, chariots, and furniture. All were in the tomb to accompany him on his journey to the afterlife, or the land of the West. King Tut's tomb had somehow escaped grave robbers, as others did not. His body was elaborately dressed for a long journey and perfumed with spices and surrounded with flowers and food and wine. Casts were taken by goldsmiths so they could model the coffin. Sculptures worked on images of the dead king. His body was wrapped in gold tissue and he wore gold collars. Over his head he wore a mask of red and white gold and blue faience, which is like a ceramic, and then tin glazed earthenware. Eventually, all the treasures of King Tut's tomb were moved to the Cairo Museum. Only the mummy of the boy still remains in the tomb. It was closed to the public in 1991 because of deterioration. And I don't know if anybody has had time or went to some of the immersion exhibits that have been coming here to the city of Milwaukee, but the King Tut last immersion exhibit was wonderful. And it really had a wonderful replica of the body, of the mummy. It had replicas. It talked about, the new work that they've been doing to kind of discover more about the king, all the DNA that they've been able to figure out who the family members are and so on. So really an interesting look at the way that the Egyptians lived and their total belief in the afterlife and their total belief in the spirit of the human. So with that, we will stop, and our next look is going to be at the Aegean.